and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. It's such a pleasure to see you here. There's some new friends and old friends, and I hope those of you who are new and here for your first time will see you again, and will soon be able to call you dear old friends. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Like all of you, we are eager for the time when we can take these masks off and see one another's smiles, and when we can have receptions at our programs and beer and wine and nibbles at our First Fridays. So let's just pray that that will happen soon and safely. But tonight is a very special night. Some of you may have been here in July or August or September and seen our new exhibit and are saying, wait, this is the opening of the exhibit? Well, Joe Elliott, our amazing photographer, and his wife Betsy were traveling, and they are home now. So we are able to celebrate today on October 1st the opening of Inspired Sound, Philadelphia's pipe organ heritage exhibit, which will be open until early December. So if you love what you see, tell your friends, invite them to come. Note on our front door, we've just extended our hours starting tomorrow. We'll be open on Saturdays from 10 to 3. Monday evenings until 7. So if you normally aren't able to get here during the regular hours, or your friends, there are new options for coming to see the exhibit. This is part of what we do at the Athenaeum. We bring together art and literature, history, culture, architecture, preservation, our built environment, all that makes us uniquely Philadelphia and uniquely part of our global world. And we've joined together with our intellectual curiosity to learn together, to study together, to ask questions together, to build relationships together so that we may have a richer Philadelphia, a richer neighborhood. So we are so glad that all of you are here. And again, if you are not a member, we invite you to become a member and become a regular part of our community. Tonight, I wanted to tell you a little bit more though. Inspired Sound, our exhibit, it's not just exhibit and it's not just tonight, but we have on October 13th a gallery talk at 3 p.m. with Joe and Joshua Castagno. We have on October 23rd at 11 a.m. a tour of Tindley Temple with Mr. Frank Tyson giving the tour, and Chase Castle, where are you, Chase? Right in the back, right, stand up so people can see you. A distinguished organist will be playing, giving a 30-minute exhibition of the organ. So we hope that you'll sign up for that. October 27th, I don't know if we have the exact time, Bruce.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock, October 27th, will be a similar tour at St. John the Baptist in Manioc. So an opportunity to explore those churches and the organs that a couple that are featured in Joe's photography. And then finally, on November 22nd, we have a closing program with Opera Philadelphia, who will be streaming as they sing with the organ at Old Pine Presbyterian Church. Will be streamed here, and then they'll be coming over to talk about the present and the future of the organ and the ways that it is being used and experienced outside of sacred music. So we hope you will join us for all of these programs. Tonight, it's a delight to welcome our panel and our conversation tonight, which looks at Tindley Temple, again, one of those very important organs that are featured in the exhibit. To look at Tindley Temple, to look at Reverend Dr. Charles Albert Tindley, his musical legacy, the musical legacy of the congregation, the organ, and what makes it special. And so I think this should be a fascinating conversation. We're going to hear from this group, and I think they are going to be busy talking and expanding the story, and then inviting all of you in to ask questions also. I want to just really quickly say, Joshua Castagno, Director of Special Initiatives at Partners for Sacred Places, is leading the conversation as our moderator. Joe Elliott, you should need no introduction as the amazing photographer of these pictures, but he specializes in photography of historic infrastructure, industry, and architecture, and I think you'll see that in his photography. Also, we have Emily Cooperman, who's an architectural and landscape historian and historic preservation consultant, who was the author of the successful National Register nomination for the Tindley Temple. At the end, we have Karen Whitney, who is an organist and church musician. She is a member of Tindley Temple, but currently is the director of the Children's Music Program at Salem Baptist in Jenkintown, and we're so glad to have you here also. Dr. Gordon Turk, raise your hand, is a critically acclaimed concert organist who oversaw the restoration of the Tindley organ. And finally, Mr. Frank Tyson, who is you're the director of the archives, historian of the archives at Tindley Temple. And we are so pleased at the wealth of knowledge and experience that our panelists are bringing. So I invite you to graciously welcome all of them to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia this evening.
Okay. Well, I feel like we also had a little coach take about 5 minutes apiece to do your little talk, and I don't think I can talk that long. I'm a photographer, so the comments that I might bring to you about what I think about photographing organs and churches and are pretty much wrapped up in what you see downstairs. So, but I can say a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to say is that this is the third, I think, the third exhibit I've had here at the Athenaeum. So I want to thank the staff of the Athenaeum, especially Bruce Laverty, for being a supporter for such a long time. I've found my way into photographing many kinds of architecture in and around Philadelphia over the last quite a few years. And I'm well, before I go any further, I want to thank a couple of the people. Again, Chase Castle, who was kind enough to make the record some performances that are being played downstairs, but also will be performing, as we just heard, at the Tindley Temple. I also want to thank another person who was a great help here, Sarah Lerner. She's back there. Can you raise your hand, Sarah? She is a student, a former student of mine at the University of Pennsylvania Preservation Program. And if you look carefully, you'll see her name on about four of the images down there. So we had to photograph almost 50 churches. And I said, there's no way I can do that. So I recruited Sarah and a couple other students from the program who did about a third or so of the churches in the whole group. So it's without the support and help of Bruce and Sarah and Chase and some other people, this exhibit wouldn't have happened. Just a couple of words about my motivations. I have always been interested in old things, old places, whether they're churches, courthouses, schools, houses, steel mills, power plants, you name it. There's something about the materials and way things were built in the past and how they've changed over time and how we perceive them now that's really always been fascinating to me. For me as a photographer, you might say, well, how hard is it to photograph a church? It's already beautiful. And as Joshua once said, a church is designed as a work of art. You know, you don't have to make a work of art out of something that other people would think, well, how could a steel mill become a work of art? But the problems are actually not that different, whether you're in a beautiful interior space that's designed to be beautiful, or you're in a beautiful space that was designed as an industrial site. There's something about the quality of light, space, and just the sense of the place that's always fascinating to me. So I guess that's the way I think about it. How do we arrive at the particular images on the wall? It's just the ones that are the most beautiful to me as photographs of all the ones we shot, finding our way through and deciding which ones are sort of have beauty and character and tell us something about these places. So I don't think I need to say anything more. I'm really here to learn a lot more about Tindley Temple. I'm just the guy that took the pictures. So I will hand it off to my colleague, Emily.
Thanks, Joe. Is my mic on? Yep, okay, great. Just wanted to check, because my voice does not carry very well. As Beth mentioned, I'm an architectural and landscape historian. I started out in the historic preservation program at Penn, and then because I'm a sucker for scholarship, I actually went on to get a PhD in architectural history, but then went on to practice in historic preservation. And so I've been in a lot of buildings, like Joe. And there is this building, I remember the first time I walked into it, when you walk into certain buildings the first time, they still have the power to be overwhelming, even if you've spent your, 3 or 4 decades in buildings as a career, and this is one of them. And I was embarrassed the first time I went into it as someone who was writing the National Register nomination for this building, that I had paid so little attention to it over the years. Hiding in plain sight is something that is really, really important in the city of Philadelphia. And in addition to writing the National Register nomination for Tindley Temple, which was a really, really rewarding project, I previously had conducted an inventory, or concocted, I suppose, might be the better word, although I didn't make things up, I hope, an inventory of African American congregations in the city of Philadelphia to, in the aid of beginning to understand what those congregations had been in the past, where they are, what the buildings are, what we say in the lingo in my biz is resources, and to begin to make an important step towards preserving those places and continuing to tell the story of the people who were members of those congregations, how the churches were woven into their lives, and how the lives of those people and the places of those churches within the larger fabric of the city of Philadelphia. And in creating that inventory, you can see a wonderful snapshot of how blacks were in this, obviously in the city of Philadelphia from a very early point, but you see groups move through the city by where the congregations start in a row house, for example, and then grow and move into a larger building, and eventually, often, if they are successful, move to a larger church, often a church that had initially been occupied by a white congregation. So the building of Tindley Temple, under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Charles Albert Tindley, was very exceptional within the history of black congregations in Philadelphia. And it wasn't just exceptional within the history of blacks and blacks' crucial contribution to the history of the city and culture of the city of Philadelphia. This was the largest Methodist congregation in the country. End of sentence. And that was something that, another embarrassment, I was embarrassed not to know. I was embarrassed not to know more about Reverend Tindley. I was embarrassed that I hadn't paid more attention to that building. And I was grateful for the opportunity to educate myself and to find all these things out and find out just how important he was, how important the church was within the fabric of Philadelphia, and how important the congregation and he was within the larger context of the country, both in terms of his music, his civil rights activities, and I'm sorry, I'm probably stealing everything you're going to say. I apologize. But it was a revelation to me. But the building, let me go back to the building, so that's really what my area of expertise is. And the building is also something that it is very unusual. It's not quite the work of art in the sense of a place that is highly decorated, that many churches are. And this isn't this isn't just because it was inexpensive. That's not the point. The point is that it is a machine. It is a machine for preaching, a machine for music, a machine for sound, a machine for participation by a congregation, in the sense that it was a building that was designed by architects who were primarily architects of factories and school auditoriums. And Bruce, correct me if I'm misremembering that, but it is the Ballinger Company. And so that they used the technology that they were intimately familiar with in terms of creating reinforced concrete structures in order to support a building that housed thousands of people every Sunday. And had to safely do that, and had to function in order to have that machine of sound work. So I think my 5 minutes are just about up, and I'll stop there, and I'll stop treading into other people's territories.
No, this is very rich. We have some really great connections already, and I was hoping you'd make that connection to what Joe discussed in terms of a range between capturing images of industrial architecture versus sacred architecture. So that was wonderful. So, Mr. Tyson, we'd love to hear from you a little bit about the history and significance of the congregation, and of course, Dr. Tindley as well.
The church, which is now known as Tindley Temple, is the fourth building. The church started as John Wesley Methodist Episcopal Church in 1837. And Dr. Tindley is the only minister who had membership in each of the four churches. Remember, he came to the city in 1870 with his first wife, and they were members of that first church. And then they had to move because they ran out of space, and so they moved further up, and they were at 11th and Bainbridge. And at 11th and Bainbridge, he took on the job as, in the church we use the term sexton, janitor. And he was the janitor when he was licensed to preach. He came back to pastor the church in 1902. And in 1906, he moved the church to Broad and Fitzwater. And that church seated 1,500 people. And the story is the fire marshal was there every Sunday morning, every Sunday evening saying, there are too many folk in here. So they bought the property next door and built East, because the name then was East Calvary Church. And it was built as a preaching station. It wasn't built as a glamorous church like many of our churches are. And it seats 3,200 people. And in the original church, there were 3,200 chairs. No microphone, and they say Tindley didn't need a microphone. And in most of our churches, we didn't have microphones. And I'll elaborate more on that when we come to Tindley, so you can see that. Now, in our display case, we have a letter, and this is relating to what Brother Turk is going to discuss. When the church when he was working on the plan for the church, he contacted the Moeller Company, and they responded telling him there were two sizes of Moeller, 4 manual, and I think the other one they may have offered was a 2 manual. And he felt the 2 manual was not going to be large enough for this big church. And so that's how the organ got there. On our way here with Sister, we came down North Broad Street, and there's a large synagogue there. That's where Dr. Tindley learned Hebrew. He took private lessons with one of the rabbis there. Dr. Tindley said he didn't have the time with his large family to go to school. So he brought the school to him.
Huh.
A library when he died of 8,000 volumes. And we're talking about hardback volumes. And a membership just short of 13,000 members. His was the original, what we call a mega church with 3,000. His was the original one. And on Sunday morning when he'd stand up to preach, he'd say, please do not come back for evening service. Some of those who couldn't get in here. And notice one thing about the architecture of that church. He built it with seniors in mind because there are only a few steps to get in from the front. And when you come around from the side street, there's only one step and you're in the sanctuary. But the basement, and I don't know where they came up with the name Undercroft, is deeper down. He kept that church packed, morning and evening. Sound biblical preacher. And during that time, he wrote over 50 hymns that we still sing. And if you've never heard Brother Teddy Thomas play one of his hymns, don't think about going to heaven till you've heard him play at Tindley's organ.
That's definitely an invitation. So I hope most of us can come out for that wonderful tour. We'll get to hear that amazing instrument. And before we just move on, could you say something just very briefly about the impact of Dr. Tindley as a musician, as a composer? You mentioned the number of hymns that he wrote. Do people still acknowledge that legacy today?
Oh, yes. There's not too many denominational hymn books that doesn't have one or more of his hymn books, one of his hymns in the hymn book. And since I'm a Baptist preacher, I love when I'm doing the tour of Tindley to remind them, we Baptists published his hymns before y'all did.
That's great.
So what do you want to say? Okay, in the Baptist Pearls, we have 5. And in the green National Baptist Hymnal, I think there are 6.
Wow.
So, but
wonderful.
All denominations have his hymns.
Incredible. What a legacy in terms of sacred music. Well, let's hear a little bit about this instrument. I think Dr. Turk wants to say a little bit about the Moeller organ that's there and what makes it so special.
You want me to use the mic?
Yes. Here we go. We'll give you one.
It was actually music that brought me to Tindley for the first time. In the summertime, I'm in residence in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, in the historic auditorium there, where I'm the artist in residence organist. And it was during one of the summer choir festivals, which was a large event, that we had a guest conductor, and that was Dr. Edward Hoy. I was so impressed with him and his way of not only working with musicians, but with people, that I thought, I want to meet him. So I did meet him there. But later, a friend said, you've got to go to Tindley Church and hear his choir and to meet him and to hear this wonderful organ. Well, I did go, and so that was the beginning of a long friendship. And I found that shortly after that, I was there playing some of the pre-Messiah organ concerts that he had asked me to do. And it's been my privilege for many years since then to play for the Messiah, and thanks to Theodore Thomas Jr., who's put me to work many times there with that instrument. It's been a real privilege and an exciting adventure. During that time, I had a friend whom I said, you really must hear Tindley. and I took her to hear some of the music at Tindley Temple. And she was so impressed. She said, she lives a distance from the city, but she said, if I lived in the city, this would become my home church. So we asked her if she would like to take on the project of underwriting an extensive renovation of the organ. And she did that. And before I go further with renovation, let me talk about the history. The instrument itself was designed, conceived, and constructed by the Moeller Organ Company. And this was in 1926 that they signed a contract, and the organ was installed in 1927. And the instrument has 74 ranks of pipes, which means that's how pipes are grouped in certain families of tone and in relationship to the number of keys that there are on the keyboards and on the pedal board. It has, as you mentioned, 4 keyboards and a pedal board. There are 4,679 pipes in the organ. That does not include the visible pipes that you see. The golden facade pipes are simply ornamental facade pipes. They don't actually speak. Behind them, that's where the great choir of pipes stand. And as I said, there are 4,679 of them. They're divided into groups that are controlled by the various keyboards and the pedal boards. It's spread across the front of the room behind these gold facade pipes. In addition to that, as you look, assuming that the pipes were here, on this being the front of the church, in that back corner, up there high in the gallery, there is another division that's called an antiphonal solo division. And in the other far corner, there is yet another division called the echo, etheria division. So all of those pipes surround you with sound. And as you spoke of the room and its acoustical properties, it's so good for speaking because it has the U-shaped balcony, so no one is too far away from the preacher at any time, even though it's a large room. But at the same time, you're enveloped with music coming from all sides. So it's a very invigorating experience. The sound of the organ is something that's very special. It reflects the tonal design. You might say the tonal architecture of organs in the 1920s and 30s. And the Moeller Company built instruments that were very resonant. They had this grand, rolling, romantic, mellow quality to the instruments. And that sound is still there. And it's a sound that's somewhat singular to that period of time. And it was so beautifully represented in the works of Moeller, and it's probably the largest Moeller organ in the downtown city at this point, and one that is particularly of that era, of that period. So its vocabulary in terms of tonal sound is something that's rich, that's mellow, that's very warm. It's quite a contrast to what you might think of in terms of Baroque sounds, but it is informed in such a way that it can play music of many different styles, periods, in a very successful and musical way. In 2006, we were able to begin a work of restoration. There were aspects of the organ which had fallen into mechanical disrepair, and it needed serious attention. At some point in the 1980s, I think it was 1984, the present console, or the console that was original to the organ, which had 4 keyboards, pedal boards, and stop tablets on the sides, which controlled all the pipes, was removed, and a more, quote, modern design was installed at that time. And this was successful for a long period of time. Also, a set of trumpet pipes were added to the organ, which are quite stunning and very beautiful. They're up on the back wall, and they stand en chamade, stand out horizontal from the wall. as the time went on, there were a lot of mechanical problems in the instrument. So we talked, John Shaw, who was the curator of the organ at Ocean Grove, where I play in the summertime, and I talked with Dr. Toy about the instrument, but then we began to converse with Theodore about the potential for this wonderful instrument in this special place. And we were very fortunate to be able to bring someone to Tindley who was anxious to be a part of something wonderful happening. She was impressed with the room, with the great tradition of preaching, with Charles Tindley and the story, and the fact that it was a living, breathing congregation in Center City. And she was very excited about the musical potential and the musical traditions there. It's interesting to point out that there have been 3 organists there, you can tell me the exact years, in many, many years. They've each had long tenures. Kenneth Goodman was the young man who grew up, I think, in the parish, didn't he? And he came to the attention of John Wanamaker at one point, and John Wanamaker sponsored his study in France with Marcel Dupré. He thought he was very gifted. He went to France, to Paris, studied with Marcel Dupré, and he came back, and he was the organist of Tindley for quite a few years. He was followed by Dr. Edward Hoy, and who had a long tenure there. And now we're so fortunate that Theodore Thomas has been here for quite a few years, and he has to get up and go to keep on going.
Gordon,
So,
yes, and I've had the pleasure of hearing the trumpets on Shabbat played by Theodore, which was quite an experience. It sounds like quite an instrument that everyone seems to fall in love with, and there's so much more attention and renewed enthusiasm for that. So I think you've given us a wonderful insight into that restoration project too. I want to make sure that we can also include Karen's story, because Karen, as a musician and as someone who's grown up in the or been a member of the congregation for a long time, I'd love to hear your perspective on this congregation, this instrument, its musical legacy. Please share with us.
Like Dr. Turk, music brought me to Tindley. I went there to take organ lessons. I had never played a pipe organ, didn't know anything about the pipe organ. And if the first organ that you play is the one at Tindley, where you go from there? You know. So piggybacking on what Mr. Tyson said, Dr. Tindley's hymns, published in every denomination's hymnal, sung by Elvis Presley, sung by Sweet Honey in the Rock. There are people sitting here today probably saying, I don't know any Tindley hymns. Oh, but you do. If you've ever sung We Shall Overcome, you need to understand that Dr. Tindley's hymn, I'll Overcome Someday, was the forerunner to that great hymn of the civil rights movement. Dr. Tindley wrote the music and the text. So the text sometimes gets separated from the music and is reimagined and reworked by other composers. But his poetry was wonderful. His was very, lots of images, Heaven's Christmas tree, and as I said, appealed to a wide range of artists and still sung by congregations all over the country, probably all over the world. Secondly, the musical history of Tindley. When you've got a 4-manual molar where the sound is rolling, did you call it? You know, there's good music there. There's good music. There's an outstanding choir. There was outstanding junior choir at one point. This was before I came aboard. I didn't come to the church until I was in my mid-20s. But I understand there was a point where the junior choir had more members than the senior choir. And young people lied about their age to sing on the junior choir. And they sang standard literature, nothing watered down, nothing, you know, it was standard repertoire. And it is where I, as a young person, once I joined the choir, where I learned the great oratorios and was forced, and so glad I was forced, to accompany some of these oratorios with the choir singing. At this point, as Dr. Turk said, it's a very unusual instrument. And so my dear colleague, Alan Morrison, has been bringing the students from Curtis Institute over to have lessons at the church, to have organ classes at the church. His students have not experienced organs of that vintage. And we are so glad to share that instrument with the community. I believe it was last week one of his students did a recording for the Michigan American Guild of Organists, and Alan is planning to do a recording of a major list organ work on that instrument. So it's going out into the community, and we're just so delighted about that as organists and as members of the church, because that's how we serve and we reach, and that's how, you know, we live out the gospel through music.
Karen, that was wonderful. I think one of the it's great to hear so many people are becoming really interested in this instrument, and especially following the restoration. One thing that strikes me, I would love to ask you about is, you know, Dr. Tindley's, you know, presence was so broad, or his legacy was so broad, as you mentioned, everything from Sweet Honey in the Rock to Elvis Presley. And it's very interesting to hear, you know, that Tindley Temple, the congregation's musical legacy is also so broad. I mean, everything from the Messiah to gospel standards. So there's also this really broad interest in music. Is that particular to Tindley? Is that something special in the DNA of the congregation and how music has been a part of its life?
I think it has to do with the instrument.
Yes.
With Dr. Tindley,
Yes.
with the people who have served as director of music, who knew that there was this legacy in the church, and used it, and used the organ to help with with the church's musical legacy. And I think it has to do with sort of the combination of all those three things meeting. You know,
Yeah.
Dr. Tindley, the organ,
Yes.
the people who were director of music there. So it's sort of a, you know, it's a organic meeting of those great forces.
That's wonderful. Yeah,
During
Mr.
that
Tyson.
period,
Yeah.
there were two other mega churches in the city. Abyssinian up in Harlem with Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and out in Chicago, it wasn't Ebenezer, Olivet. And they had about the same membership.
Okay.
The difference was Tindley was the only hymn writer of those three.
Right. So like I said, it's those forces that all came together.
Writing the hymns and then having folks singing them. Because I'm told Sunday afternoons they would have hymn things where he would introduce his new hymns. So those other churches didn't have that.
Right.
The only church that would be close to it is, I think, in Memphis, where W. Herbert Brewster pastor, and he wrote a lot of songs that Clara Ward and Mahalia Jackson made famous.
Okay.
But that's the only church.
So it was all of those forces meeting at Broad and Fitzwater.
That's amazing.
Right.
So that also leads me to ask a question about, and I'll just ask a couple more questions before we invite our attendees to also engage in and share their thoughts, because this is a very rich conversation. But I'm thinking about something that you've said, Dr. Turk, and Emily has also said. You know, this building was so interesting. This location was really prominent. It's a major building. It stands out in some ways for its monumentality, I think is the word that you used. And it seems like the instrument itself also is perfectly paired with that. I'd love to hear more from maybe both of you about maybe the ambition or the scale of both this instrument and this building and how they relate to each other.
Well, the instrument was designed for each pipe to be able to speak appropriately in this large space. you could relate it somewhat to singers, and you say that a child's voice would produce a certain sound in the right context. But to really fill that space, you had to have a mature voice that would reach to all the corners of the room. And the pipes of the organ that were designed for that room have great resonance and a wonderful resounding effect. One thing that I'd like to mention that's rather unique in the restoration of this organ is that I mentioned that the original console had been removed in the 1980s. Tindley's church, very uniquely, and I've never heard of it happening in any other situation, took the old console. They really revered it. It was so, I think it was great affection for Dr. Hoyt. They stored it in the basement, the undercroft that you mentioned, and actually encased it in a little room in glass. And there it has sat for years, gathering some dust, but somewhat protected. When we came to the end of the restoration of all the mechanical aspects of the organ and anything tonally that was renovated or that was polished and designed, we then thought it would be appropriate to bring back the original console. It was such a part of the room and the space, and it just suits the organ so much. So that was the last aspect of the restoration, in which the old console, which was downstairs, at that point was whimpering in the corner, and it needed lots of tender loving care. So that's what we gave it, and the woodwork was brought up. It's beautiful oak on the outer part of the case, mahogany on the inner parts of the organ, where the stop tablets are. And we had to have new keyboards built for it because the old ones had deteriorated beyond repair. So now the original console is back in place, and it's so right architecturally, and it's so great musically.
And Dr. Cooperman, you were saying...
It's a treat that's been recycled.
You were saying a little bit about I think in some ways you're implying how modern this building was. It wasn't a church architect. And, there's something that for folks who are not organists, we were talking about this as we were preparing for this panel, about the relationship between between an organ and the way that it's installed, the relationship between an instrument, because it's in place, it doesn't move, right? And I think you had something to share about that.
Well, I think one of the things that I was just now thinking about, the fact that there is something that is, we're talking about this building not emphasizing the ornamental in the sense that many churches. It's not a cake that's covered with icing. It is a building that performs its function so effectively and so movingly, and still has that sense of the ineffable when you walk into it, and the sense of power. And I was saying, when we were preparing, one of the things that particularly struck me is, this is not absolutely unique, but it is the heightened sense of theatricality that you see in that building. One of the things that I have never seen anywhere else is the fact that there is a baptismal pool that is behind a curtain, underneath those sort of stage pipes that you were talking about, up in the front of the church, so that there is a sort of performance of baptism that can take place in that church in a way that I've never seen in any other church. It is remarkable. Yeah, I mean, it is, baptismal events or something that are sometimes off to the side, but not like this.
But in many of our black churches, the baptismal pool is always behind the pulpit.
But it's not made into this sort of big theatrical event, is it?
It's not as big as
Tindley. Yeah, that's the thing. Yes, that was.
And when they were building Tindley,
it's like a swimming pool. It's enormous.
It is.
But 4 blocks away is the historic Union Baptist.
Yes.
Where Marian Anderson was a best known member.
Absolutely.
And the folk at Tindley said to the Baptists, we're building a larger pool than y'all have.
I sense a certain sense of competition between
yes.
congregations.
Yes.
Wow, what
And the other unique thing is Tindley Temple, and I think this is still true, is the only United Methodist church with a pool.
Probably.
Because Methodists don't tend to immerse.
Let's just see, there aren't many of them.
Yes.
So,
That's certain.
Another thing that we didn't mention was Dr. Turk said the pipes are back here.
Right.
The console is 60 feet
that's
away.
right.
You don't find that. Usually the pipe organ console is right near the pipes. Not in that church.
It's very far away, but it's a great gallery, the projecting balcony there. So before we open up to questions and start to wrap up, and we would love to hear thoughts from the audience, I have one question for Joe, because you've gotten away with it for a little while here. But one thing I'm curious about, because you are so known for your accomplished works in capturing and documenting industrial buildings, and the relics of industrial and manufacturing processes. I'm really curious about this project. This is the second time we work together through Sacred Places and capturing sacred places, but this time it was a machine inside a building. So I'd love to hear, a little bit about trying to capture this machine, but it's also part of the building, and your thoughts on that, which I know you have some really wonderful things to share.
Okay, I don't think okay, I suppose. Work? Okay. Hold it. Yeah. All right. Yes, I was, one of the things I meant to say is that everything you see in this exhibit is an interior view. And of course, that's where the organs are. But it also speaks to my interest in architecture from the interior rather than the exterior. I'm much more interested as a photographer in the problems of how to photograph an interior. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more variation compared to photographing an exterior. But if we take that a little further with, you might say industrial process, we've already talked about Emily mentioned that this building, the Tindley Temple, is a kind of religious machine. It's a place where people gather, they hear the pastor speak, they hear the music, and it's all designed, with all those things integrated together. But if we look at that machine a little more carefully, and most people walk into a church and say, "Oh, look at those beautiful pipes," and in fact, we find out that the pipes are the ones you see going to work. So the interesting thing for me is looking at machines is like, let's go inside the machine. And this is one of the most interesting things about a pipe organ. It's a sound-making machine. You can crawl inside it. It's like, unlike, say, you might try to crawl into a tuba or something, or maybe like look at a piano inside, but the organ is a machine you can truly explore from the inside. So that was really a lot of the fun for me in doing this work. Is let's find the pipes, let's find the way into the pipes, and sometimes that means you're opening a hatch in the ceiling and you're climbing up a ladder and hoisting yourself up in there. It may not even have a light that works, so it's kind of like you've got to have a headlamp on. It's kind of like spelunking, it's like you might say, wow, it's like a cave with like metal stalagmites, and so the sort of visual and sort of exploration of what we see and understanding the process is really interesting to me. And then we go a little further, and that's why I put the photos in of the blower. Like, how does this machine work? What does it take to make that sound? So anyway,
You saw a lot of instruments, and did this one stand out from the other? I know I sent you to a lot of places, sometimes very interesting circumstances where there wasn't a sound to be had, but how did this one stand out?
This one stood out, and actually Sarah was helping me with this one. It's a big pipe chamber. It goes from several sections across that back, behind that row of pipes in the front. You're climbing from one to the next, and you'll see in the photograph downstairs, you're seeing the main one chamber, you're seeing another one beyond it. So it stood out that it was actually easier to get into than a lot because it's so big. And it was pristine inside. You know, that's one of the things that we discover in looking at pipe organs is some of them are maintained and some of them are not. So sometimes you're in there and you're covered with dust. You know, it's like an old factory. But this one was, you know, nice to spit and polish it. It was great to be in there.
Thank you, Dr. Turk.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I think, well, and I remember actually thinking about it, you know, organ chambers often make me feel very claustrophobic, but I thought we could have a few of us have lunch in that one. I mean, there was enough space for a picnic. So I would love to hear if there's a question. Yes? Sure.
Talk a little bit about the project, the Partners for Sacred Places began that initiated this and what the results of that survey were.
Oh, sure. So, well, I can be on the spot too. So, Playing and Preserving was a project that was supported by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the Wincote Foundation, and the 25th Century Foundation. And the goal of that project was, you know, these instruments, you know, for a long time, Partners has tried to raise awareness about sacred places, about historic religious properties, what's happening to them, what's their value to the community, what legacy and history is there and might be at risk, and how can we really make the most of these for our communities. Well, we thought to ourselves, pipe organs are probably in the same situation, if not worse. Yeah. As a lot of congregations have had less resources or traditions have changed, they've invested less in things like pipe organs or stained glass. And so probably there's this rich heritage of instruments that are at risk, that are being lost. But we don't know enough. So our goal was to do a couple of things. Primarily, the way we got involved with Joe was to document them. So we went through and tried to figure out how many historic organs were there and send people out to survey them. So we worked with students from Curtis who actually surveyed them and tried to document what they found. In some cases, there was not much to be found, sadly. And then also have Joe photograph these places, and also actually had the Curtis students try to do a sound recording, simple sound recordings. So we could have these simple field recordings of these instruments. So we worked with the Oregon Historical Society, put that information online, so if you go to their Oregon database, you'll be able to see the entries that came out of our work and search that so you can find out more about these Philadelphia instruments. There were two other parts of that project. Karen, by the way, was a fantastic member of our project advisory committee, which is how we got to know one another. And she provided such wonderful key advice and connection, too, to a lot of the places. You don't believe how hard it is knocking on doors trying to get in churches sometimes. But there were two other quick components, one of which was to provide re-grants to some of these churches in order to help them actually restore them. And we did training with those congregations to help them. How do you take care of your organ? Do you actually know how your organ is built? How an organ is built? Sometimes you'd be surprised. The trustees know very little about an instrument, or what a manual is and what a stop is. So when the organist comes saying, "I need to pay the bills for this," they say, "Well, I don't really understand." So we did training, which Tindley Temple actually hosted our training, which we're really grateful for that, to provide some resources and show congregations that were getting re-grants. And then the third part was we worked with St. Mary's Hamilton Village as a site for performance. And we worked with Play on Philly and Astral Artists to bring together rising classical musicians and student musicians and really show people how exciting and fun the organ could be, and also show young people what an organ is, what kind of fun, exciting sounds it makes, and how it can be used in a variety of repertoire. So that was my attempt at a brief description of the project, but that's how we got to know Joe. And of course, we worked with Joe earlier in Fishtown and Kensington to document churches there, some of which were actually lost and demolished. So we're really glad for his photographs. Great. So any other questions for any of us actually up here? We'd love if someone did have a question as we kind of come to the close. Yes. Oh, right back here. Yes. We are friends with them. We're all preservationists, and we all care about the city. I mean, our focus is a little bit different. We think more nationally, and we're focused on religious properties. But yeah, we're definitely connected to them. And we had a question up here too.
What is the membership of Tindley Temple now?
About 100.
I am not, I'm a member, but I'm also a church organist. So I'm never there on Sundays because I'm working. So I'm really not the person to ask. Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
There may be about 100,
Okay,
Yeah.
but there are not 100 that come in.
right.
Yeah.
And is the denomination fully United Methodist?
Yes.
Opposed to A&E or?
No, it's United Methodist.
United Methodist.
United Methodist.
Right.
The background is this was a church, a denomination started by John and Charles Wesley. And it was then called the Methodist Episcopal Church. And then in the 1939 merger, they dropped the Episcopal name and it just became the Methodist Church. Then in the middle 60s, when the Evangelical United Brethren joined, then it became United Methodist.
Well, did you have a follow-up? I wanted to add something to what Emily said about being impressed and amazed about entering that church when she first saw it. Because I had a similar impression and experience when I went into St. George's, now United Methodist Church, at 5th and New Street, 4th and New Street.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the founding church of the United Methodist, or First Methodist Episcopal Church
Mm-hmm.
in America. I
Yes.
mean, that is the longest still standing and in use Methodist church in America.
Right.
And it looks like a meeting house from the outside
Right.
if you go down
Mhm.
44th Street. And I had been in a museum area doing another type of survey in the Independence Hall area on historic buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, I had never been in the church itself. And when I went in, I was floored, because it is huge. And it dates from 1763. And if you haven't been in that church, you must go at some point, because it was renovated again in 1837 to add a larger balcony side in the church. But at the same time, the entire facades, which are right next to the Benjamin Franklin Building Bridge, are still all there. And that's the original place. And it was not built for the Methodists to start.
That's right.
It was built as a Dutch Reformed church. And it dates with the 1763 date stone.
That's right. St. George's has a very, very interesting history, and one of those places to certainly see. And actually, also is connected to the history of Black Methodism in the United States. And Philadelphia is very important.
Because that's the church where Richard Allen and his folks
Right.
left to go
Right.
to Mother
Yeah.
Bethel.
But that's
Yeah,
also
that's
the
right.
church where Mother Zora left.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
to
Because
organize-
Mother Zor, one of these interesting
Okay.
things
But-
is that
but you
there
use-
were some that wanted to start their own denomination and some that chose to
But
remain with the
you used
Methodists.
the word huge. You used the word huge. It's a huge church. You could sit St. George into the middle of Tindley and you know,
Yeah.
you still have
Well, remember, Christ Church's steeple was the tallest structure in North America for how many years? So standards change over time. I think that we've come close to the end of the time. Are there any pressing questions or reflections? Otherwise, I think it's time for us to kind of bring our event to a close. I want to say, was there something? I want to say thank you to this wonderful panel. I think you've given such a rich picture here tonight. Really so exciting, and so many accomplished people here, and all coming together, as you said, Karen, so beautifully, this organic, dynamic coming together of all of these threads and themes. So really beautiful. Well, thanks to all of you for being here, and thank you for coming out and sharing with us a little bit tonight. Yes.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody again. Joshua and Bruce and I had sat down early on and kind of had this thought, and then pulling it together, all these fabulous individuals who are very busy and gave of their time and their experience and expertise. This was just a wonderful panel, came together beautifully. So I'm so grateful to all of you. So we have coming up next, Wednesday, October 13th. If you have our event guide, it's in here. You can go online for exact details of the tours because those are not here. Wednesday, October 13th, 3 p.m., Joshua and Joe will do a gallery talk. So if you want to hear more specific, go into details about the different photographs and what was happening, please come to that. October 23rd at 11 a.m. is the tour at Tindley Temple. And October 27th is the tour at St. John the Baptist in Manayunk at 1 p.m. Please go online to get the exact information and to register ahead of time to attend. There is a fee for each one of those tours, and the fees will help also cover donation to the congregations for the time that they are giving and their expertise. Reverend Tyson, I believe you're doing the tour at Tindley Temple on the 11th, so you already know you're gonna get a great one. And Chase will be playing at Tindley, and I think we're still determining who's gonna play at St. John the Baptist, but again, your tour ticket helps cover those costs for these congregations and the music and all that you'll be receiving.
There's sight and sound tours.
Exactly, sight and sound. Sight and sound. And then November 22nd at 6 p.m. will be our experience with the Opera Philadelphia and the future of the organ. So you'll come here with the big screen to get to hear them singing and performing with an organ. We couldn't figure out how to do it here with an organ. So we'll live stream them in, and then it's close enough that they're going to run over here, and we'll have another great panel conversation with composers and musicians and organists about organs in non-sacred situations.
Might just say that the Opera Philadelphia's interest in this came through because during the pandemic, they were thinking about new things to do. Oh, I should probably use the mic,
Yes.
although I'm used to this shouting. And they came across the website for the Playing and Preserving Project and said, well, what if we recorded in some churches? And so they did this wonderful online project, Organ Stops. You can look it up. They did this wonderful video for that project, and that's how they made this connection. So we said, let's bring them to the Athenaeum, because that would be really exciting.
Yes. So lots of fun, all thanks to Joe and his photography, which of course so thank you, Joe. Everybody have a lovely, if you're interested in preservation also, of course, we're supposed to have Clive Aslett in from London on Tuesday, but you've probably been hearing it's not going to be until November that people can fly across the pond to come and visit. So we're trying to find a date. They're trying to figure out a date for him to be here in November. But on Thursday, we have Tom May's Why Old Places Matter in conversation. There should be a great conversation with Star Hair Cardio and Randy Mason. So I hope you will join us for that also, 6 p.m. next Thursday. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming. We're so glad you came.